A soldier's final promise. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about courage, family, sacrifice, and hope, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and become part of our growing community. Your support encourages us to bring you more unforgettable stories every week. My name is Daniel Harper, and for most of my life, people knew me as a soldier. They saw the uniform, the medals, and the disciplined smile. What they never saw were the sleepless nights, the promises I carried, and the memories that followed me long after every battle had ended. This is not a story about winning a war. It is a story about keeping a promise that changed my life forever. Some promises are made with words, while others are made with a single look, between two people who understand each other, without speaking. Mine was the kind that stayed alive through fear, distance, and time. If you have ever made a promise that meant more than your own comfort, then perhaps you will understand why. I could never walk away from the one I made on the coldest night of my life. That promise became my mission, even after my service came to an end. I was 22 years old when I first put on my military uniform. I still remember standing in front of the mirror, trying to look confident while my hands quietly shook. My mother smiled with pride, but I could see the worry hidden behind her eyes. My father simply placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "Character is measured by what you do when no one is watching." Those words stayed with me through every challenge that followed. Training was harder than I had imagined. Every morning began before sunrise, and every evening ended with muscles that ached from exhaustion. Many recruits questioned whether they belonged there. I questioned myself too, but every time I wanted to quit, I remembered my family and the responsibility I had chosen. Slowly, I became stronger, not just physically but mentally. A few months later, I was assigned to a unit filled with experienced soldiers. At first, I felt like the youngest brother among them. They came from different cities, different backgrounds, and different families. Yet we quickly learned to depend on one another. In our line of work, trust wasn't something you earned over years. Sometimes it had to be built in a single difficult moment. That was where I met Michael Turner. Michael had an easy smile that could brighten even the longest day. He loved telling stories about his wife, Emily, and their little daughter, Sophie. Every evening, after finishing our duties, he would pull a worn photograph from his pocket. The edges of the picture were bent from being unfolded so many times, but he looked at it as if it were brand new. He often showed me the photograph and laughed. One day, he would say, "I'm going to surprise Sophie by showing up at her school instead of telling her I'm coming home. I want to see the look on her face." Listening to him made me think about my own family waiting back home. We all dreamed about returning safely. We talked about birthdays we had missed, family dinners, fishing trips, and ordinary weekends. Those simple dreams became more valuable than anything money could buy. Life on deployment followed an unpredictable rhythm. Some days passed quietly, while others demanded every ounce of focus we had. We learned to appreciate the smallest moments: a warm meal, a letter from home, or a few minutes of laughter with friends. Michael and I became close friends before either of us realized it. We watched each other's backs, shared stories from childhood, and promised that no matter what happened, neither of us would ever face hardship alone. One cool evening, as the sun disappeared behind distant hills, we sat outside our temporary shelter watching the sky grow dark. Michael looked unusually serious. He folded the family photograph and slipped it back into his pocket. "Daniel," he said quietly, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." I looked at him, sensing that whatever he was about to say would stay with me for the rest of my life. I turned toward Michael and noticed that the usual warmth in his smile had faded. The evening breeze carried the scent of damp earth, and for a few moments neither of us spoke. It felt as though he was searching for the right words, knowing they carried more weight than either of us wanted to admit. Finally, he took a deep breath. "Daniel," he said, "have you ever thought about what you'd do if life didn't go the way you planned?" I gave a small shrug. Every soldier thinks about that. We just don't talk about it very often. He nodded slowly. "You're right." From his jacket pocket, he carefully removed the same photograph of Emily and Sophie. He looked at it for several seconds before handing it to me. "I carry this everywhere," he said, "not because I'm afraid, but because it reminds me why I keep moving forward." I studied the picture. Emily's smile looked full of hope, while little Sophie couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She was missing one front tooth and looked as if she had just burst into laughter. "They're beautiful," I said. "They're my whole world." For several moments, we simply sat in silence. Then Michael looked straight at me. "If something ever happens to me ... I immediately interrupted him. "Don't say that. We'll both make it home." He smiled, but this time it was the smile of someone who understood that life doesn't always follow our wishes. "I hope you're right," he replied. "But if I'm not lucky enough to get back, I need someone I trust." I felt my chest tighten. "Daniel, promise me you'll find my family. Tell Emily that every decision I made was for her and Sophie. Tell my daughter that her father never stopped thinking about her, not for a single day." His voice remained calm, yet I could hear the emotion behind every word. "I've written letters for them. They're sealed inside my backpack. If I come home myself, they'll never need them. But if I don single quotes ... He couldn't finish the sentence. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "You have my word." He reached out his hand. "No matter how long it takes, no matter how long, no matter how difficult, I promise." We shook hands firmly, but it felt like far more than a handshake. It felt like I had accepted a responsibility that would remain with me for the rest of my life. For the first time that evening, Michael smiled again. "I knew you'd understand." The next few days passed with our usual routines. We completed assignments, checked equipment, and encouraged one another through long hours. Michael seemed lighter after our conversation, almost relieved, as though sharing that promise had lifted a burden from his shoulders. He even joked with the rest of the unit again, making everyone laugh during dinner. Watching him laugh, I silently hoped that the promise I had made would never have to be kept. At that moment, I truly believed we still had plenty of time ahead of us. I had no idea that before another week had passed, everything would change. And those simple words, "You have my word," would become the most important promise of my entire life. The following morning began like so many others. The sun had barely risen, and a cool wind swept across the camp. Everyone moved with quiet determination, checking equipment and preparing for another mission. No one complained. By then, we had learned that every assignment deserved our full attention, no matter how routine it seemed. Before we left, Michael walked beside me with a cup of hot coffee in his hand. "When this is all over," he said with a grin, "you're coming to my house for dinner." I laughed. "Only if you're ready for me to eat half your food. Emily makes enough for an entire neighborhood," he replied. "Trust me, you won't leave hungry. And Sophie, oh, she probably spend the whole evening asking you questions about being a soldier." We both laughed, and for a brief moment, the future felt certain. It felt close enough to touch. As our convoy moved through the quiet countryside, everything appeared calm. Birds circled overhead, and the road stretched peacefully into the distance. Still, every soldier remained alert. Experience had taught us that appearances could change in an instant. Hours passed without incident. We completed the first part of our assignment and began preparing for the journey back. Spirits were high because everyone believed the hardest part of the day was behind us. Then everything changed. A sudden explosion echoed across the road, shaking the ground beneath us, thus filled the air, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The peaceful silence disappeared, replaced by confusion and urgent voices calling out directions. Training immediately took over. Each of us focused on protecting one another and moving to safer positions. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I searched through the cloud of dust. "Michael," I shouted. There was no answer. I called his name again while carefully moving forward. A few seconds later, I spotted him several yards away. Part of the path had collapsed, leaving him unable to move safely without help. "I'm here," he called, trying to stay calm. "I've got you," I answered. Ignoring my own fear, I made my way toward him. Every step required complete concentration. When I finally reached him, I grabbed his arm firmly. "You always pick the worst places to take a break," I joked, hoping to ease the tension. He managed a weak smile. "I figured you'd come find me." Of course I would. Working together, we slowly moved away from the damaged area until we reached the rest of our unit. Everyone immediately checked on one another, making sure every soldier was accounted for. Thankfully, no one had been left behind. As emergency teams secured the area, we finally had a chance to catch our breath. Michael sat beside me, unusually quiet. He stared toward the horizon without saying a word. After several minutes, he reached into his pocket and felt the folded photograph of Emily and Sophie. "They're still the first thing I think about," he whispered. I nodded. "And they're the reason you'll see them again." He looked at me with grateful eyes but didn't respond. Somehow, both of us understood that the day had reminded us how quickly life could change. That evening, as darkness settled over the camp, neither of us knew that the hardest test of our friendship was still waiting just ahead. The promise I had made was about to face the moment that would define the rest of my life. Sleep was almost impossible after everything that had happened that day. Although the camp had grown quiet, my mind refused to rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I remembered the explosion, the cloud of dust, and the fear of not finding Michael. I kept telling myself that we had all made it through safely, but something deep inside me felt uneasy. The next morning, our commanding officer gathered the unit before sunrise. "We have one more assignment before returning to base," he said. "Stay focused, trust your training, and look after each other." Those last words stayed with me. As we prepared our equipment, Michael walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you didn't sleep much either," he said, handing one to me. "You know me too well." Double quotes. He smiled. I didn't realize they would become the last peaceful conversation we would ever share before our lives changed forever. The next morning felt different from any other. The sky was clear, and the camp was unusually quiet. But an uneasy feeling settled over me the moment I woke up. I couldn't explain it. Sometimes, after spending enough time in the military, you learn to trust your instincts even when there is no obvious reason to worry. Michael was already awake, sitting outside our shelter with a small notebook in his hands. As I walked over, he quickly closed it and slipped it into his backpack. "Writing another letter?" I asked. He smiled softly. "Just adding a few lines for Emily and Sophie. I like leaving them little memories. Maybe one day Sophie will read them and know what her father was thinking while he was away." "You'll tell her yourself." "I hope so," he replied. "But writing them gives me peace." A short while later, our commanding officer assigned us to escort a humanitarian supply convoy carrying food, medicine, and other essential items to a nearby community. It was a mission focused on helping civilians, and everyone understood how important it was. We checked our vehicles carefully and began the journey. The road stretched through open countryside, passing fields, small villages, and quiet hills. Children could occasionally be seen waving from a distance. Michael waved back with a smile every time. "They remind me of Sophie," he said. "You really miss her, every single day." After several hours, we safely reached our destination. Watching families receive the supplies reminded all of us why service wasn't only about facing danger. Sometimes, the greatest victory was bringing hope to people who needed it most. As we prepared to leave, dark clouds began gathering overhead. Rain started falling lightly, turning the dirt roads muddy and difficult to travel. The convoy slowed to keep everyone together. Visibility became poor, and communication required complete concentration. Then, without warning, one of the supply trucks became stuck in deep mud near the edge of the road. Several of us climbed out to help. Michael and I worked side by side, attaching heavy towing cables, while other soldiers carefully coordinated the recovery. The rain soaked our uniforms within minutes, but no one complained. After several determined attempts, the truck finally broke free, and a cheer rose from everyone nearby. Michael laughed. "I don't think I'll ever complain about rainy days at home again." "You keep making that list longer. I've got years of ordinary life to catch up on." As the convoy continued toward base, the rain slowly stopped. A beautiful rainbow appeared across the horizon, and for a brief moment everyone admired the peaceful view. Michael looked at it quietly. "My daughter loves rainbows," he said. "She says they're God's way of reminding people that storms don't last forever." I smiled. "She sounds wiser than both of us." He chuckled. "She probably is." That evening, after we returned safely to camp, Michael handed me a small sealed envelope. "If anything ever happens to me, this stays with the letters." I looked at the envelope but didn't open it. "I still believe you'll give this to your family yourself." "So do I," he answered. But as he said those words, I noticed something in his eyes, a quiet understanding that life could change without warning. Neither of us realized that before another sunrise, The promise we had spoken about weeks earlier would finally face its greatest test, and nothing would ever be the same again. I barely slept that night. The rain had stopped, but the cool wind still swept through the camp. I kept thinking about the sealed envelope Michael had given me. It rested safely inside my backpack, untouched. I had promised myself I would never open it unless he was no longer able to deliver it himself. Before sunrise, our unit received another assignment. It was expected to be a routine patrol through a region we had traveled before. No one imagined that the day would become the turning point of our lives. As we prepared our equipment, Michael walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee, just as he had done so many mornings before. "For good luck," he said with a smile. I accepted the cup. "I think you've made this a tradition. Then don't break it." We laughed quietly, trying to enjoy one more ordinary moment before heading out. The patrol began peacefully. The morning air was cool, and the rising sun painted the distant hills with shades of gold. Birds flew overhead, and for a while it was easy to believe the day would pass without incident. Michael walked beside me. "When I get home," he said, "the first thing I'm going to do is hug Emily and Sophie. I don't care who's watching. You shouldn't care. And after that, we're taking a road trip. No phones, no schedules, just family. You've planned every detail. I've had plenty of time to think about it." His smile made me smile too. Around midday, our team reached a narrow mountain road surrounded by steep rocky slopes. The path was quiet, and everyone remained alert as we continued forward. Then we heard it. A loud crack echoed from the hillside above. Before anyone could react, loose rocks began tumbling down the slope. It wasn't a massive landslide, but it was enough to force everyone to move quickly toward safer ground. The team immediately spread out, helping one another avoid the falling debris. I reached safety and turned around. Michael wasn't beside me. "Michael," I shouted. He answered from farther down the road. "I'm here." I saw him helping another soldier, whose leg had become trapped beneath several large rocks. Without hesitation, Michael stayed with him, instead of running to safety himself. "I'm coming," I yelled. I started toward them, but another soldier grabbed my arm. "The slope is still unstable. I can't leave him." Together, several of us carefully moved forward as more rocks rolled down the hillside. When we finally reached them, the trapped soldier had already been freed. Michael had done it, but while helping him escape, Michael had been struck by a large falling rock that knocked him to the ground. We rushed to his side immediately. He was conscious. He looked at me and somehow managed to smile. "I guess this wasn't exactly how I planned today." "Don't talk," I said, kneeling beside him. "Help is already here." Medical personnel reached us within moments and began treating him with calm professionalism. As they worked, Michael reached for my hand. His grip was weaker than I had ever felt. He looked directly into my eyes. "Daniel ... I'm here. If I don't make it ... you will." He gently shook his head. The promise. Tears filled my eyes as I squeezed his hand. "I remember. Take care of them." "I swear I will." He smiled one final time, not with fear, but with peace. I knew I chose the right friend. Those were the last words he spoke to me before he closed his eyes. The world around me became silent. At that moment, I understood that my life would never again be measured by the years I had served, but by the promise I now had to keep. I don't remember much about the journey back to camp. Everything around me felt distant, as if the world had suddenly lost its sound. I sat in the transport vehicle holding Michael's backpack tightly against my chest. Inside it were the letters he had written over the past months, the sealed envelope he had trusted me with, and the small photograph of Emily and Sophie that he never left behind. For the first time since we had met, Michael wasn't beside me making jokes or talking about home. The empty seat next to mine said more than words ever could. That evening, our commanding officer gathered the entire unit. We stood together in complete silence, each of us remembering a friend who had always put others before himself. No speeches could truly describe the kind of man Michael had been. He had earned everyone's respect through kindness, courage, and quiet leadership. After the gathering ended, I returned to my quarters alone. I carefully placed Michael's backpack on the table. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. My hands trembled as I reached for the sealed envelope, with my name written across the front. "To Daniel." I slowly opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. Dear Daniel, if you're reading this, then life has taken a path neither of us wanted. First, I want to thank you. Thank you for being my friend, my brother, and someone I could trust without question. I know keeping a promise like ours won't be easy. There will be days when you wonder if you've done enough. Please don't. Just tell Emily and Sophie that I love them every single day. Tell Sophie that every birthday I missed broke my heart, but not a single day passed when I stopped believing I'd see her again. There's one more thing I need from you. Don't let them remember me only as a soldier. Tell them about the man who laughed too loudly, burned pancakes every Sunday, and danced terribly in the kitchen just to make his daughter laugh. I want them to remember my life, not only my service. Whatever happens, thank you for carrying this promise. Your brother, Michael. By the time I reached the final line, tears blurred the words on the page. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. The following morning, I received permission to return home. Most soldiers looked forward to going home with excitement. I was carrying a different kind of responsibility. Every mile brought me closer to meeting the family. Michael had spoken about almost every day. I had imagined that meeting many times, but now that it was becoming real, I found myself questioning whether I would have the strength to say the words they deserved to hear. During the flight home, I held the photograph of Emily and Sophie in my hands. I studied every detail of their smiling faces. They're waiting for you, I whispered quietly. Then I corrected myself. No, they're waiting for me. At that moment, I realized the hardest part of my journey had never been on the battlefield. It was waiting for me at the front door of Michael's home, where a promise made between two soldiers would finally have to be fulfilled. The flight home felt longer than any journey I had ever taken. I spent most of the time staring out of the window, watching the clouds drift by. In my lap rested Michael's backpack, carefully zipped shut. I had promised myself that nothing inside it would be lost or forgotten. When the plane landed, I took a deep breath before stepping outside. The familiar sights of home should have brought me comfort, but all I could think about was the address folded neatly inside my pocket. Emily and Sophie were waiting for answers. I rented a car and began the drive to Michael's hometown. It was a peaceful place filled with tree-lined streets, small family homes, and neighbors who greeted one another with friendly smiles. As I drove through the quiet neighborhood, I understood why Michael had talked about it so often. This was the life he had dreamed of returning to. Finally, I stopped in front of a modest white house with blue shutters. Children were riding bicycles nearby, and colorful flowers bloomed along the front walkway. Everything looked warm and welcoming. I remained in the driver's seat for several minutes. My hands rested tightly on the steering wheel. No military training had ever prepared me for knocking on that door. Eventually, I picked up Michael's backpack, walked slowly to the front porch, and pressed the doorbell. A few moments later, the door opened. Standing before me was Emily. I recognized her immediately from the photograph. For a brief second, hope appeared in her eyes as she looked past me, as though expecting Michael to step out from behind my shoulder. When she realized I was alone, her expression quietly changed. "Can I help you?" she asked softly. I swallowed hard. "My name is Daniel Harper." She nodded politely. "I served with Michael." The moment she heard those words, she understood why I had come. She closed her eyes for a second, taking a slow breath before inviting me inside. The house was exactly as Michael had described it. Family photographs covered the walls. A small drawing, clearly made by a child, hung proudly on the refrigerator. There was laughter frozen in every picture. Emily offered me a seat, but neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, she asked the question I had been dreading. Was he thinking about us? I reached into the backpack and carefully removed the worn photograph Michael had carried every day. He never stopped. Tears filled her eyes as she accepted it. He looked at this photograph every chance he had. He talked about you and Sophie constantly. He dreamed about coming home, about family dinners, school events, birthdays, and quiet weekends together. She gently held the picture against her heart. "I knew he loved us," she whispered, "but hearing someone else say it means everything." Just then, I heard small footsteps running down the hallway. A little girl appeared around the corner. She looked almost exactly like the smiling child in the photograph, only older now. She looked at me curiously. "Mom." Emily smiled through her tears. Sophie, this is your daddy's friend. Sophie walked closer. You knew my dad. I knelt to meet her at eye level. Yes. Was he brave? I smiled warmly. He was one of the bravest and kindest people I've ever known. She smiled proudly. I knew it. Then she reached forward and hugged me without saying another word. In that quiet moment, I realized my promise wasn't ending with delivering letters. It was only just beginning. Sophie's unexpected hug caught me completely off guard. For a moment, I forgot every word I had planned to say. She held on tightly, as if she somehow sensed that I had carried a part of her father home with me. I gently returned the hug before she stepped back and looked up at me with curious eyes. Did my dad ever talk about me? She asked. I smiled, even though my heart felt heavy. Every single day. Her face lit up. Double quotes, really? Emily quietly wiped away her tears as she listened. I reached into Michael's backpack and carefully removed the bundle of letters he had written. Each envelope had Emily's or Sophie's name written neatly on the front. He wanted you to have these, I said. Emily accepted them with trembling hands, treating them as though they were priceless treasures. She held them close for several moments before placing them carefully on the table. Then I handed her the final sealed envelope. He asked me to keep this safe. She looked at the familiar handwriting and gently smiled through her tears. He always wrote my name exactly like this. Neither of us spoke while she carefully placed the envelope beside the others. Over the next few hours, we shared stories about Michael. I told them about the jokes he made during long days, how he could lift everyone's spirits with a simple smile, and how he never stopped talking about coming home. Sophie laughed when I told her about Michael, pretending to be a terrible singer, just to make the rest of us laugh. He really did that, she giggled. Almost every week. Emily smiled. That sounds exactly like him. As evening approached, she invited me to stay for dinner. The smell of homemade food filled the kitchen, reminding me of everything Michael had described during our conversations overseas. As we sat together, Emily suddenly looked at me. Daniel, Michael once told me that if anything ever happened, you'd probably blame yourself. I lowered my eyes. I keep wondering if I could have done more. She gently shook her head. He wrote about you in one of his letters. She opened one envelope and quietly read a short passage. If Daniel ever comes home without me, I want him to know he kept every promise that mattered. He was the kind of friend every soldier hopes to have. I don't want him carrying guilt. I want him carrying hope. I couldn't hold back my emotions any longer. For months, I had carried the weight of that day alone. Hearing Michael's own words felt as though a burden had finally begun to lift. After dinner, Sophie disappeared into her room and returned carrying a small wooden box. She carefully opened it. Inside were photographs, birthday cards, and little keepsakes that Michael had given her over the years. She gently placed the worn photograph from his backpack inside the box. It belongs with the rest of Dad's memories, she said. Looking at that small box, I finally understood something important. Keeping my promise wasn't only about delivering letters or sharing stories. It was about making sure Michael's love, kindness, and example would continue to live in the hearts of the people he cherished most. And as I prepared to leave that evening, I realized my journey was nearing its end, but one final promise still remained to be fulfilled. As I stood at the front door preparing to leave, Emily stopped me. Daniel, she said softly, would you come back tomorrow? I turned toward her. Of course. Sophie has a school ceremony. Families have been invited, and she was hoping you might come. I looked at Sophie, who stood quietly beside her mother. She smiled shyly. Dad always said his friends were family too. For a moment, I couldn't find the right words. Finally, I nodded. I'd be honored. The next morning, I arrived at the school a little earlier than expected. Children were running across the playground, laughing with their parents and grandparents. The sound of their happiness filled the air. As I watched families gathering together, I couldn't help thinking about Michael. He had dreamed of standing exactly where I was standing now. Emily and Sophie soon arrived. Sophie ran toward me with excitement. You came. I promised I would. She smiled proudly before taking my hand and leading me inside the school auditorium. The ceremony celebrated students who had shown kindness, honesty, and determination throughout the year. When Sophie's name was announced, the audience applauded warmly. She walked confidently onto the stage and accepted a small certificate from her teacher. Then the teacher smiled. Sophie would like to say a few words. Sophie stepped up to the microphone. For a second, she looked nervous. Then she began speaking. My dad couldn't be here today, but he always told me that being a good person is more important than being a famous person. The room became completely silent. He taught me that courage means helping others even when it's difficult. My mom reminds me of that every day. She paused before looking directly toward Emily and me. And today, one of my dad's best friends came because he kept a promise. My heart stopped. He told me stories about my dad that made me smile. Now I know my dad never stopped thinking about us. Several people quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Sophie continued, "My dad said that promises matter because they show people they can trust you. Mr. Daniel kept his promise, and because of that, I know my dad's love will always be with us." The audience rose to their feet in applause. I couldn't hold back my emotions. After the ceremony ended, many parents walked over to thank me for sharing Michael's stories with Sophie. I simply replied, "I was only doing what a friend should do." Later that afternoon, Emily handed me one final envelope. Michael's handwriting covered the front. "For Daniel after everything." "I didn't know this existed," Emily admitted. "He must have hidden it with the others." With her permission, I opened it. Inside was a short letter. "Daniel, if you've reached this point, then I know you kept your promise. I also know you'll probably say you only did what anyone would have done. Don't believe that. Not everyone keeps their word when life becomes difficult. You did. Now I have one final request. Don't spend the rest of your life looking backward. Go home to your family. Laugh again. Dream again. Live the life both of us hoped for. That will be the greatest way to honor our friendship. Your brother always, Michael." I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my jacket. For the first time in many months, I looked toward the future instead of the past. Michael had trusted me with the most important promise of his life. Now, at last, I was ready to keep one final promise to him to truly live my own life again. I kept Michael's final letter in my jacket pocket for a long time. I didn't carry it because I was unable to let go. I carried it because it reminded me that friendship doesn't end when two people stop seeing each other. True friendship lives on through the promises we keep and the lives we touch. Months passed, and I slowly began building a quieter life. I returned to my hometown and spent more time with my parents. For the first time in years, I enjoyed simple mornings without rushing anywhere. I helped my father repair the old fence around our house, and I sat on the porch with my mother as she shared stories from my childhood. Those ordinary moments became precious because I finally understood how quickly time passes. Even though I had returned home, I never forgot Emily and Sophie. We stayed in touch, and every few weeks I would visit them. Sophie loved telling me about school, her drawings, and the books she was reading. Each time I visited, she seemed a little taller and a little more confident. One afternoon, nearly a year after my return, Emily invited me to a special event. "We're dedicating a memorial bench in Michael's favorite park," she said. "We'd really like you to be there." When the day arrived, friends, neighbors, and former members of our unit gathered beneath the shade of tall trees. It wasn't a grand ceremony. It didn't need to be. The people who loved Michael stood together, sharing stories and smiling through tears. When it was my turn to speak, I looked at the faces around me and took a slow breath. "I met Michael because we wore the same uniform," I began. "But I remember him because of the kind of man he chose to be. He believed that courage wasn't only found in difficult moments. He believed courage was shown through kindness, honesty, and keeping your word." I paused and looked toward Sophie. "He once asked me to make a promise. At the time, I thought it would be the hardest promise I would ever keep. Today I realize it became one of the greatest honors of my life." After everyone had spoken, Sophie walked over to the bench and gently placed a single white flower beside it. She smiled. "My dad would have liked this place." "I think he would," I replied. Before we left, she reached into her pocket and handed me something small. It was the old photograph Michael had carried every day. "I want you to have it," she said. I looked at her in surprise. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "Dad carried it to remind himself why he kept going. I think you should keep it now, because you helped bring him home to us through his stories." I carefully accepted the photograph. At that moment, I realized Michael's promise had never really been about delivering letters. It had been about making sure his family always knew they were loved. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees, I stood quietly for one last moment. I thought about the frightened young soldier I had once been, the friend who had changed my life, and the promise that had carried me through grief toward hope. If there is one lesson my journey taught me, it is this: life is not measured by how many years we are given, but by the love we share, the kindness we offer, and the promises we choose to keep. And whenever I look at the faded photograph resting safely in my home, I don't remember loss. I remember a loyal friend, an unbreakable promise, and a family whose love proved that even after the hardest goodbye, hope can still find its way home. The end of story. At last I requested you to subscribe over channel Mystery Tales at Mystery Tales-P7M9I. Because of your one subscribe, we felt better. No one can grow aloe, it grow with all together. You know that one video take about 1 or 2 days to make it take great effort. Your no response ma disheart us, please respond us, maybe happy and maybe live long.